You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Hello everyone, I'm Ben Eagle and welcome to another Meet the Farmers mini-series being produced in association with the Forestry Commission. This time we're talking about agroforestry, the benefits, practicalities and the questions our guests think that you need to be asking before committing to an agroforestry project. So in this episode, we are going to be digging into Silvopasture and Silvoarable systems and discussing how they work. And I am joined once again by my co-host from the Forestry Commission, James Ramskir-Gardiner. James, good to have you back. Do you want to briefly summarise what we learnt in the last episode with Claire when we were looking at, I suppose, just the general benefits of agroforestry systems?
Sure. So we touched upon quite a few benefits of, which there are with agroforestry. These included shade, shelter and browse for livestock, as well as being able to introduce more diversity into the farm and thinking ahead for the next 100 years of what farming might look like and how trees can help us through it all.
Right, let's introduce our guest for today. We are joined by Sam Morgan, who is a first-generation tenant farmer from the Essex-Suffolk borderlands, very near to where I grew up, actually. He farms beef cattle on the banks of the River Stour, as well as working with farmers and landowners across East Anglia to deliver independent farm conservation advice and hands-on management, especially with regards to agroforestry. And he even spent a good deal of time studying agroforestry whilst doing his MSc in agroecology, water and food sovereignty. I think that sounds like a great MSc at Coventry University's Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience. Sam, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much. A hell of an introduction.
Well, there's a lot in that. I mean, do you want to just dig into that a little bit more and tell us a bit more about how you got to where you are now?
So I've always kind of grown up where I am now, a village called Cornarden in the town of Sudbury, not far from where I was born at Bury St Edmunds. I went away to Nottingham to study agriculture just to expand my horizons a little bit, and then had a bit of a break before I went to Coventry University. And that Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience. And that's where everything kind of changed, although that sounds kind of cliched. But it was a fantastic course where I was exposed to fantastic people. But unfortunately, I think the last year of that running was last year, which is a real shame. But
really?
The centre continued to do really brilliant work.
Okay. And tell us a little bit more about what you're doing on the ground where you are.
So at the moment, I work for a farmer across from my own tenancy. So that's a kind of beef and arable farm immediately over the river from where I farm on the Suffolk side. I also deliver quite a bit of advice to people locally on how they can improve their farms for wildlife. I've designed a few agroforestry projects for people locally, which have exclusively been Silvoarable at this point. But in those projects, livestock are an important part of the rotation as well, which I think, it's a bit more of a mouthful. I've heard people refer to that kind of agroforestry as agro-silvopastoral. So that's a big term I'm going to throw out there.
There's going to be quite a few of those today, I think. James, let's turn to you and dive into today's topic. So we're talking about Silvopasture and Silvoarable, but before we go into some specifics and chat all this through with Sam, just give us an overview first of all. Apart from, I suppose, there's the obvious that we're dealing with pasture and we're dealing with arable with each of these, but just give us a little bit more on each of these.
Absolutely. So, as you say, Silvopasture is the integration of livestock and trees. Now, we have a lot of this across the UK landscape. This could be recognised as wood pasture. It could be orchard grazing. It could be grazing in woodlands themselves. Another phrase used under that umbrella is silvopoultry, where you're specifically mixing chickens into a tree-based system. But all of these come under that generalized header of silvopasture. The same with silvoarable. It is that purposeful integration of trees with the crops. This primarily looks like rows of trees in arable fields, and I'm sure we'll get into the detail of why that might be later on. Another way you could be looking at this is something called silvohorticulture, which is that integration of trees into growing fruit and vegetable crops. So, Sam, I've gone through those couple of things. We're going to start off with silvopasture. For you, what does a silvopasture system look like in practice?
So they are infinitely varied, as I think you've alluded to already. Silvopasture, the first thing that springs into my mind just when I'm thinking about it is kind of those grazed wood pastures, perhaps the most idyllic form of silvopasture. But I'd also include hedges that are well managed for their benefits for the landscape, but also for the livestock as well. So the shrubs and trees included within them can deliver, all sorts of benefits to cattle, sheep, whatever. And if they're managed in a way to benefit the livestock side of the business as well, I completely consider that silvopasture too. You've spoken about silvopoultry and the benefits for poultry. I think they're enshrined in some of the standards, Freedom Foods, the RSPCA's standard for, I think it's for their egg production. They did, when I was doing my research at Coventry, specify a kind of 10% tree cover for their poultry systems, just because the benefits were so pronounced. But yeah, it comes in all shapes and sizes. With the arable systems now, with more and more livestock integration for the benefits that they can bring to those systems, it could well be that a silvoarable system, your kind of alleys of trees in fields, could be considered silvopasture as well. So it's a very vague answer to say, it can be basically anything with trees, shrubs, livestock.
Absolutely. I think that's the real clinching point for me with certainly silvopasture, is that the devil's in the detail. There's a whole host of different spatial arrangements and designs you could put those trees into the landscape for whatever your objective is. Really good to hear you mention about tree rows and livestock. Primarily people tend to associate rows of trees with arable crops in silvoarable systems. I see no reason why we can't utilize those tree row systems for livestock, especially if we're looking at multi-purpose pasture, where some years you might be grazing it directly, other years you might be taking a cut from it. Those rows really help with that mechanical machinery side of things, as well as helping to create almost the infrastructure for mob grazing type systems that you might be using.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, that actually brings in a whole other question, actually, James, which is when you have land that is multi-use and you might be working on, I don't know, a 5-7 year rotation, and as part of that, you might integrate a lay. So if you're in that turned a multi-use system, how would you plan your agroforestry system around that aspect?
You plan it around your farming system. So you plan it around the machinery, not only the machinery that you use now, but machinery you're potentially going to be looking to upgrade to later down the line. As we said, we referenced Claire in the last episode, her 100-year plan. We don't know what farming machinery is going to look like in 100 years. I've heard rightly concerns from some arable farmers around machinery getting bigger and worrying about planting themselves into a corner effectively. I may be slightly less concerned about machinery getting bigger. I think the state of our machinery is it's potentially going to go smaller as more of it becomes automated potentially. But it's a really important thing. You only want to plant the tree once. So we want to make sure when we're planting it, we're doing it at the right distance that allows for the different kit that we want to use. I focused on machinery there because that's generally the biggest thing that might get in the big, trees might be getting in the way of fencing, especially we've got more and more an improved temporary fencing, electric fencing. That's maybe not quite the barrier it might have once been.
Sam, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I'd agree. You've got these no fence collars as well for livestock where you don't need any fencing, with clues in the name really. But for flexibility of grazing in places where kind of more managed grazing wouldn't have been possible in the past, that's opening all kinds of doors. And I am aware, I think people have been using those no fence systems within woodland and bale grazed areas where they're leaving round bales of grass out for the cattle as a way of managing bracken. And I've seen really good results there.
So on that, Sam, mentioning about livestock, what kinds of livestock do you think work best in a silvopasture systems? And specifically, what are the benefits to those animals and the farm?
I think they all stand to benefit. There's a lady from the Organic Research Centre, Lindsay Wistance, who, when I was doing my research project, her work, as well as Joe Smith's from the Organic Research Centre, was just so brilliant for kind of putting those benefits out there and talking about how, different class of livestock, whether they're cattle, sheep, goats, rely to varying degrees or if given the opportunity, will browse rather than graze. Goats being like the number one example. I think they go up to something like 95% preference for tree browse. But for the benefits, I mean, I was reading an article very recently just talking about willow specifically in one magazine. And there are benefits there I mean, you've got the obvious ones of shade and shelter. And as long as the trees aren't too valuable, it depends on what you want to do with the trees afterwards. They make for incredibly good scratching posts. So for managing external parasites, which isn't one that's mentioned so much, but their browse has a range of nutritional and medicinal properties. I mean, one of the things that made me really think agroforestry, and in many ways it's a new name for an old system, is the future is because it was at the Real Farming Conference. Lindsay was talking about certain tree browse mitigating methane emissions because of the condensed tannin content. So there's all these, nutrition, medicine, kind of reducing the need for wormers, which have all kinds of environmental consequences. Also for kind of mitigating those methane emissions, which are such an important topic within ruminant farming.
I think to continue on the cheerleading of willow, if I may, for a little bit more, willow has got to be one of my absolute favorite species in an agroforestry system. You talk about the benefits for lambs and the work that's been done recently, and you're absolutely right that there's research and positive signs looking at them reducing methane emissions. You've got that salicylic acid, so livestock can self-medicate themselves as needed. And there's lots of little happy accidents or like happy coincidences in there, such as a time of year when lambs are being weaned off their mothers. They, are in quite dire need of cobalt. But that unfortunately happens at the same time of year that cobalt is generally at its lowest in most grass forage. But the happy coincidence is that's at the time of year where cobalt's at its highest concentration in willow. So just by introducing that willow fodder, willow browse into recently weaned off lambs, you can dramatically decrease your lamb mortality rate and improve their survival and growth. It's just those little happy coincidences that, to me, just make this all seem to make sense and be a bit of a no-brainer.
So, Sam, in terms of challenges, and we're talking of Silvopasture still here, what do you think are the key challenges and how do you overcome them?
I think probably the main overarching one is maybe a gap in knowledge, skills about how to manage trees, what you're managing trees for. That kind of informs the planning of these systems so much that it can maybe be off-putting to even start, just knowing where to start from. But challenges after that, it's making sure you know what your livestock may potentially do to those trees and making sure they're adequately protected so that they can reach their potential. That's really important there are some breed societies out there of certain sheep that I won't mention, but they talk about them not having a preference for browsing on trees, which is brilliant. But I still think it's something to be aware of, because I would probably say if there's not very much grass about, they're probably still going to eat the trees. So it's just making sure that when you are planting them, that they're adequately protected. But thereafter, it's kind of as part of the fun of it about integrating these things, seeing what the cattle have a preference for example, at different times of year, and then working out a management plan kind of iteratively each year. Pollarding was one of those practices that is considered quite historic way of managing trees and making sure that you're producing perhaps poles or whatever at a certain height. And they were always cut off at 6 foot or something like that to stop the animals being able to reach them. And learning those kind of things as a way to produce not necessarily timber products, but great trees for biodiversity. And there's so many interesting things you can do with it. It's just getting started.
We are perhaps stepping into the territory of the third episode here on the how. And listeners, there's a bit of a teaser to encourage you back on Friday, if you're listening to this on the first week it comes out. Episode 3 will be out on Friday. But when it comes down to where you shouldn't be planting trees, is there anywhere to avoid, Sam?
So in my own context, I am literally, when I say I'm on the banks of the Stour, the River Stour, that I am on the banks of the River Stour, it's floodplain meadow. And there are trees planted along the river, and trees have all kinds of benefits for rivers, for shading, cooling, limiting bank erosion and whatever. But the floodplain meadow, one of its real attractive qualities for certain wildlife coming in, like waders, lapwing. Well, the impression I get is they like wider open spaces, and it would be inappropriate to plant trees in those spaces because it could well deter them from considering that kind of decent breeding habitat or decent foraging habitat. I don't know whether it's to do with hiding spots, perching spots for predators, but the advice tends to be kind of keep those areas open. And floodplain meadows can be species-rich grassland. It's trees in certain places, but certainly not all over the place, because that would have impacts on the wildlife I'm trying to encourage as well.
I think this is a really, really important topic. And before I delve into any of it, I guess I'd really like to emphasize that we have many specialist colleagues within both the Forestry Commission and Natural England who can help you navigate any potential constraints that you might have across your land. So with that kind of caveat out of the way, it's really important to remember we need to keep a balance in our landscape. And that's important that it's at a landscape level. And there are going to be some areas of land that aren't appropriate for the planting of trees, even potentially at quite a small scale. Sam's mentioned about ground nesting wading birds, and that's a really important constraint that we have. Other things we need to consider are some other priority habitats we might have. We have an incredible resource of peat, especially up here in the northeast where I'm based. We've got some amazing areas of peatland, which are incredible long-term carbon sinks, and a really rare habitat, especially when you look at the rest of Europe even. England is really, and Scotland, are really leading the way with peat. Other really important considerations, again, not everything's in the northeast, okay, but it's got a lot. Another important consideration is historical environment. I have a famous little wall that runs along called Hadrian's Wall that's not too far from me. We have
I thought you were going to rename it then, James's Wall.
Not quite yet. Give it a few years. We've also got a great collection of castles, old Roman ruins, and older features as well. These are culturally significant and important resources and artifacts that we need to protect. And in some cases, it won't be an answer of no trees, but they'll need to be taken into consideration, whether that's with appropriate buffers or choosing quite shallow, lightly rooting species rather than really deep kind of earth-shaking rooting species. So I think it's really important to be realistic about the land that you're looking to put trees on, and to work in collaboration with those who can help you find the best balance for what's appropriate for that land.
Let's move on to arable systems, silvoarable systems. James, you gave us a short introduction to this earlier on, but how do crops and trees coexist? I'm going to use that word in a silvoarable system.
Yeah, so short answer is they coexist really well. The trees are providing multiple benefits to the crops, similarly as they do to livestock. These can be whether it's just sheltering the crops from either really strong winds or from sun. These can help massively reduce the evapotranspiration of those crops, really help them survive far better in potential drought conditions, which we are unfortunately seeing more and more of. The trees can also help pull moisture and nutrients from deeper in the ground, closer up to the surface, where they can be better used by the crops. Certain trees can also help to fix nitrogen in the soil, as well as providing an additional crop, whether this is a food or a fiber. It's also, I know I've spoken before about the positive benefits that the trees have to just our soil health. Healthy soil loves a good tree. Another phrase that you hear used in regards to agroforestry, and I think especially with silvoarable, is you're effectively farming in 3D. Crops lie across the surface of our ground and maybe go down to maybe no further than 30 centimeters into the ground. The trees, however, are mostly occupying that space both above and below the crop and spreading out and just making far better use of the space you might have, especially thinking in Sam's situation where you're a tenant farmer and you really want to maximize every square acre of ground that you're renting.
Yeah. Can we just pause on that point actually of tenancies and agroforestry and how this sort of interacts? I mean, Sam, I'm interested in your direct experience, I suppose, but also the situation generally for tenants. If there was a tenant who was interested in exploring some agroforestry, James, I'm sure you have comments on this as well, but how do they go about it, and do landlords tend to be pretty understanding in your experience?
So in my experience, I've got just unbelievably supportive landlords for all the weird and wonderful stuff I want to try, and I've only got it for a limited time. It's for new entrants, but they really do humour me, which is great. So when I was doing my thesis in 2019, around about then, there was talk of it kind of being tree planting and potentially reducing land values. There was the basic payment scheme at the time, which when I was looking at the really exciting papers talking about what you needed to do to be able to access the funding, that they would specify maximum tree densities per hectare. And that would be, considering how important that was back then, that would have been quite a barrier for people considering adopting agroforestry, because the prospect of losing that payment per hectare would have really been a challenge to justify. Nowadays, I don't know, because tree planting is a long-term game, and I don't know whether all landlords would necessarily be supportive of that, especially on farmland. Farmland values are not decreasing for not having trees on there. It'd be great if it was the other way around.
Made lots of really good points. I'm going to pick up on one of the last things you said there about planting trees into agricultural land. And I think it's important that we make it clear to not just ourselves here, but to listeners, what we're talking about here. We're not talking about taking that land out of agricultural use or activity. That there is a discussion to be had around woodland creation, and in some places it's appropriate, but that's something we've covered in previous series we've done. What we're talking about here is introducing trees into agriculture, not replacing agriculture. So I just think that's a really important kind of context to set initially. Talking about tenancy and agroforestry, however, it comes down to, and Sam's a great example of this, it really comes down to the landlord, and a tenant's relationship with that landlord. People like Sam have got really open-minded landlords who are really keen to support and can see the benefits behind introducing agroforestry systems, whether that's farm business benefits or biodiversity benefits or any of the others. Large landowning organizations such as National Trust comes to mind, are really keen and supportive for allowing tenants that freedom to work with them. And I think that's important. It's almost like a partnership rather than it being, I pay rent to you. It does turn almost more into a partnership or a collaboration, because both parties effectively have a say in that land, as they are such a long-term investment. There's a great example in Devon that I like to talk about in different presentations I give. You've got area of land, I think the field parcel itself is maybe 50 acres, belongs to an estate in Devon. It's got a tenant farmer who rears cattle on it. They have sublet the rows of trees out to a local fruit and juice provider. So that fruit and juice provider have taken on all the costs, all the management, all the risk of those tree rows. The tenant farmer is not only paying a reduced rent, because the other portion is being made up by the fruit grower, but his cattle are receiving all of that shelter shade benefits from the trees, with barely decreasing the amount of grazable land that there is for him. And the landlord's very happy because his field's in really good condition, providing wonderful benefits for the livestock and for nature, and they're still getting their full rent. So Sam, we've talked a bit about obviously Silvoarable there. In your view, what types of crops tend to work best with trees, and how would you kind of best manage any potential light competition?
There is research, I think, that's come from Wakelands talking about crop productivity across the alleys between the tree rows. I can't remember what the figures were off the top of my head, but the information is definitely out there if you have particular crops and trees in mind. I would say, anything can work really, as long as the trees are planted in a way with, particularly sunlight in mind and reducing shading of the crop. I think, as an example, white clover might decrease under shade, but that's something that you can manage by planting your trees in a particular orientation, so north-south, or you can manage it by managing your trees by pollarding or coppicing. Those trees can then lend themselves to producing biomass. They can become really interesting trees for biodiversity, and at the same time, you are managing any potential issues that have arisen over the years. If those trees get particularly tall, if they are particularly spreading, by introducing a new form of management, you can control that. And I know we've said that you kind of want to plant a tree once, and that would be ideal. But if issues do arise over the course of these trees' life, whether that is too much shading or whatever, if you pick the right species, you can pollard, you can coppice, and manage any of those issues that come up. In East Anglia, I do a bit of hedge laying myself. There's no East Anglian style. I think back in the day they used to just coppice hedges, but that's a really nice way of rotationally managing a woody element on a farm, where if excessive shading becomes an issue, you can manage it.
I have a question about root mass development, particularly in relation to drainage, springs to mind, but also maybe again relating back to crop competition, but also on the positive side, overall crop health and resilience as well, and soil condition. Just any comments from either of you really on the matter of agroforestry in silvoarable systems and drainage, but particularly that, I'm thinking of that root mass development.
I think it comes down to species selection again. There are certain trees that would put out roots that would search for those really wet spots, stuff like aspen. It pays to get to know your trees before you plant them. But at the same time, there's research done in, I think it's North Wales, the Pont Brem project, which I think Woodland Trust Again, this is from a few years ago. I really need to update my research knowledge. But the infiltration rates there, it was on grassland. The infiltration rates there, I believe, were 26 times higher. So although your land drains are getting blocked, if you're improving infiltration by 26 times, maybe there's a certain kind of counterbalance there. But I wouldn't like to be quoted on that if someone plants up a field of whatever and all their land drains get blocked. But it's just something to think about.
Yes, because say this. This is when that disclaimer on the podcast that this podcast does not constitute advice really comes in handy. James, have you got any comments on the drainage front?
Absolutely. So I totally recognise and agree with 99% of what Sam and others have said around obviously infiltration of water through the planting of trees. Completely on board with that. The bit where I would push back very politely is land drains. If your drain is maintained and runs well, tree roots will not be hunting it out for water source. Things like aspen, willow, alder, other kind of really wet feet loving trees are looking for standing pockets of water. If your drains are working, there won't be water standing in them. Yes, there'll be water rushing through them when we have downpours, but there won't be a standing water element in them. So I recognize for a lot of farmers across the country that concern around their drains. And the potential of planting trees, I think that can be massively mitigated by just ensuring you're managing and clearing your drains out appropriately. So Sam, are there any particular types of trees that farmers should consider when planting in a silvoarable system?
I think because of the nature of arable soils, I speak to friends about this who are involved in kind of woodland planting and woodland management. Arable soils might not be, your typical soil from a kind of fungi to bacterial ratio for tree planting. I like to kind of think of it as a bit of a ecological succession project. So if you are planting on quite denuded soils, maybe look at pioneer species like birch, and then you could always kind of progress as those, particularly in this is me talking about silvoarable setting with tree rows that are undisturbed. Then perhaps you could try and implement succession yourself. But I would say a lot of it comes down to the end goal. What do you want to achieve with these trees? Is it diversifying what your farm is producing? Okay, well then look at kind of fruits and nuts if you've got a way of marketing them. Have you got a biomass boiler on site? Look at copseal species, something like hazel, for example. If you've got wetter ground, you could do like short rotation coppice, willow. If you're thinking longer term, then look at longer term kind of an oak or something like that. Or you can produce really good timber from sweet chestnut, and that's maybe a quicker rotation than oak. Now, I mean, when I first started doing this, I worked in conservation for a bit, and it was all about planting native broadleaves. I would really advocate like diving into what the climate is set to do, in the coming decades and centuries, and perhaps looking at trees that aren't too far away, maybe from further south in Europe, but potentially looking at those as interesting species to try.
James, you're really gonna want to come in on this, aren't you?
Well, I don't know. Trees are a bit, old fay. So completely agree with what Sam there. Couple of favourite species of mine I want to give a shout out, if there's such a thing for a tree species shout out. I love wild cherry. I think it's got incredible potential to grow, especially in silvoarable systems, can produce a really high quality timber product in 30 to 40 years. Cherry especially is great because it needs to be pruned by hand. It's not a great self-pruner like many of our broadleaf species. So having it planted in row systems works really well to grow it, because it's easy access. You're going to be needing to prune those trees anyway to manage the light levels. So it's a win-win. You're pruning to ensure your crops are doing well, but you're also pruning the trees to grow a really great kind of cash crop at the end of that rotation. And to touch on Sam's point about looking at kind of considered and safely introducing non-native species into our agroforestry systems, I think Italian alder has got a really great role to play. It grows really fast. It grows well in wet conditions and can be a great source of general biomass for the farm. Whether you're using that, if you've got a mixed farm setup, whether you're using that for bedding, you're using it to heat the farmhouse, for firewood, or if you're using it to sell it on into the chipwood industry. Those would be a couple of my kind of shout outs on top of what Sam talked about.
Let's talk a little bit about management, kit, machinery. Is this just simply a matter of you need a decent pair of loppers, some decent secateurs? What are we talking about?
Well, it can be as complicated or as straightforward as you like. I was working on a project I helped plan a couple of years back, pruning apple trees, and I was literally going with a pair of loppers and a pair of secateurs. I was very enjoyable work. So that's the fairly low tech end of the spectrum. I mean, you've got all kinds of amazing machinery now that will help you harvest fruits and nuts, from a variety of species. You've got, if you're doing short rotation coppice, you've got really expensive forage harvesters and whatever that would deal with that. But that's kind of specialist contractor territory there. It's not something I'd advocate someone just planting a new system to go out and purchase, because they're quite expensive.
James, I mean, when I look at some of the kit that foresters have now, and you look at your woodland kit, and it's quite impressive, isn't it? But I mean, are we talking? What are we talking about for farm scale agroforestry projects?
So for me, farm scale agroforestry really goes back to human scale forestry. That's what we're looking at here. We're not looking at large harvesters and forwarders coming in to crisscross our fields and pastures regularly, like they would in a kind of a more productive woodland setting. We are looking at human scale forestry. So definitely hand tools, a good set of secateurs, a good hand saw at your side, and a good, safe three-legged orchard ladder. You could do the vast majority of all kind of management work to most tree species across your agroforestry system. When it comes to the actual harvesting of it, you're looking at small scale, low impact forestry kit, potentially, so hand felling, small size forwarders to pull material out to roadside, potentially horse logging, which I know might be seen as a little bit quaint, but it's definitely having a bit of revival in the kind of forestry world, where we have got just far better understanding and consideration about the impact on the soil that our large scale machinery is having. Obviously, when it comes to fruit and nut harvesting, that's going to be very specific to what it is you're growing. They still do an awful lot of picking by hand. But then I know Archie Ruggles-Bryce, who is not far from you, Sam, at Spain's Hall Estate. He's just planted a very large scheme full of walnuts, and he's exploring olive picking machinery from the continent, where it effectively drives along the side of the tree, arm goes out, grabs the tree with a big upside down umbrella, and kind of shakes and collects the nuts. The kit is going to be slightly more specialized, obviously, depending on what fruit aspect you're going for. I think for me, the last part I really want to make about machinery and equipment to manage either of these types of systems are each individual farm does not need to own all of its kit. I'm really keen to see and trying to work with farming clusters across the country to develop a slightly more kind of cooperative mindset, something akin to what we see a lot of on the continent, where machinery, knowledge, and kind of labor pool is almost shared at specific times a year when that harvesting and management is appropriate.
Do you know of any farmer clusters who are actively working on agroforestry projects? Or, I know there are the sort of the landscape scale schemes as well. Does agroforestry sort of dip its toe into that at the moment? Is anyone actively doing that? Do you know?
So that I'm not aware of a specific cluster group that is doing it. Obviously, we are still in the relatively early days of uptake.
Yeah.
Certainly consistent enough uptake in a localized geographic area. It's definitely work myself and my team are trying to push through with the cluster groups, almost laying the foundation so that when there are enough in that area, it's something they could look to consider.
And in my neck of the woods, I would just shout out the landscape recovery project I'm a part of. I'm probably the smallest landowner. God, I'm getting ahead of myself. I certainly don't own the land. But the underpinning of that project is creating these woody corridors, linking, particularly in the Walltowns cluster, which is more towards Bury St Edmunds. They're fragments of ancient woodland, and although it's not kind of agroforestry by name, it's going to be delivering benefits to farm systems. But yeah, I mean the whole kind of natural regeneration point of view, and and deer management, which is such a crucial part of that, is kind of underpinning the whole project.
Now, farmers tend to think long term. It's the nature of the job, and foresters certainly think long term when we're thinking with trees. But, and this is one of those, how long is a piece of string? And it'll depend on species, it'll depend on the project. But in terms of seeing results, and I think that's always a difficult thing to define anyway, what is the first big sign, I suppose, that a project is working? Does this come down to your planning stage and actually setting out some aims and objectives in the first place to know what you're looking out for? How do you sort of know what you're looking to achieve, and then you can celebrate when it's going well?
I a tree establishment, once it's planted, is a really obvious measure of how successfully you've planted those trees. And then, I mean, really, as soon as you start enjoying the look of it, I think you're already starting to see results. When we're talking about ecosystem services delivered by agroforestry, the aesthetic value, the landscape value is one of those. And in a Silvoarable setting, when you're not disturbing those rows that the trees are planting on, there are undoubtedly benefits for soil health from that point onwards. But if you want to think about it more from a production point of view, I suppose it's whenever you start producing fruit, or you 5 to 10 years in, when you're cutting out your first bits of hazel or whatever. That could be a really nice first milestone to aim for. But trees and hedges and agroforestry, it all takes management to get there.
I would say a good measure that will be applicable to most agroforestry systems, whether silvopasture or arable, is to remember that the shelter provided from a tree is about 10 times the height of that tree. So within a couple of years, certainly depending on if you're planting a quick growing species, within a couple of years, you could have some really quite significant shelter already in place, again, for livestock and crops. And as Sam said, with any of the fruiting species, whether fruit or nut, most of those will be starting to produce a crop within a few years from planting. Depending on the root stocks and varieties that you've chosen, you could potentially be hitting peak production of apples, let's say, within a handful of years from planting. Again, you're absolutely right, though, Ben. A lot of these thoughts and milestones effectively should be considered and thought of during that planning stage. I think it's really important we find a balance between getting on and getting some trees in the ground, but also just making sure we are spending enough time to really consider exactly what we're doing and how we're going to get to our end objective.
Now, Sam has mentioned deer at least a couple of times, and certainly here in Norfolk, I mean, the population is absolutely booming, as I know it is in counties across the country, really. So just some comments really on protecting your trees, especially in those early stages of establishment. Any tips from either of you?
Certainly understanding the deer that you have locally. and the Forestry Commission have some good information on the height of guards and whatever that you should be considering if you've got, say, just muntjac, if you've got roe, fallow, reds. And then really, I mean, but I do think we are guilty of not really tackling the main problem. When we're coming up with all of these biodegradable guards, really, I mean, bulletproof things to put up with all kinds of, animals and whatever, all kinds of deer management across the landscape, kind of coordinated deer management that is done professionally is so important if we want any kind of woody regeneration. I think farming and conservation and forestry, everyone kind of agrees on. It's about coordinating it, and it's brilliant with the landscape recovery project I'm a part of. That is probably the most crucial part of it, is trying to figure out how we can, because once you do that, you are going to start to have more natural regen, and I think it'll be a very different picture if they were better managed.
Any type of deer control really need to look at it from a landscape scale. So I think Sam's absolutely on the money with that. It'd be really safe to say that our country overall is overgrazed. And I'm not referencing our livestock in any way, shape or form, just purely our deer population. We have an incredibly overgrazed landscape just by deer. We're running at numbers multitudes of times higher than there really should be in our landscape. And I know that the national kind of deer team within the Forestry Commission have been doing some incredible work to really get a national scale bill in place to really tackle this with the full force we're able to. Protection, however, for trees in any agroforestry system is going to have to take into consideration anything that's going to want to take a bite out of it, effectively. And that's from the littlest of voles, which absolutely love trees, all the way up to deer, regardless of what size and species you have, and as well as including our own livestock that might be sharing that space with the tree. So protection is going to look specific for the location it's in and the farming practice that's going on around it. You've then got considerations to take in about, sometimes is it better to guard each tree individually, or is it better to fence off areas potentially? But then that might add a complication in if you've got large scale machinery running up and down, so there's quite a few things to consider and find the balance for.
Do either of you have anything else to add before we round up?
I would like to add something. We were talking about managing trees and the machinery and this kind of thing. In a silvoarable setting, one of the most important considerations is if you're talking about fruit, when that fruit is going to be ready to pick, how is that going to work with the crop you're growing in the field at that time of year? If you've got timber to extract, do you want a really valuable crop growing at the same time? So it's really important to have an understanding of both the arable side of the field, but also the tree element as well, and the different points of harvesting and management, and can you even get there? It's a really important factor to consider.
James, any final thoughts before we wrap up this episode?
My final thought goes back to protection. And I was very rude and I left out my own personal arch nemesis that we have in the country. And that is the cute little grey squirrel who yeah, there we go, who has, dare I say, infested the landscape and is the bane of any hardwood producing forester in the country. We talk about protecting from deer, really important. I mentioned voles, really important. Protecting our trees from livestock, really important. Protecting them from squirrels is equally as important. And again, that is the kind of control that needs to be put in place at a landscape level. If individual little pockets are doing it, those areas are just going to be infilled from the surrounding area. Again, thinking about working more cooperatively with our neighbours, regardless of whether they're farmers or not. Neighbouring landowners really should be working together as much as possible to really help us all benefit.
I did hear someone say with grey squirrels once they'd never see them go more than 20 meters across the ground. So I thought, oh, we're planting trees at 24 meter, 36 spacings or whatever in fields. Squirrels are never going to be a problem. And I think it was walking on one of these projects, and it ran. I saw a squirrel run all the way across the headland, probably 40 odd meters. I thought, a bit of wisdom that I thought I got then about squirrels not running more than 20 meters. Absolute rubbish.
Squirrels don't have pedometers. They don't know how far they've gone.
That's true. Not yet. Not yet. It's only a matter of time.
But on that note, on the note of squirrels running marathons, we will leave it there. But a big thank you to our guest today, Sam Morgan. Sam, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you also to my co-host, James Ramskir-Gardiner, who is going to tell us what is coming up on the next episode.
Thanks, Ben. So next time in our final episode of this mini-series, we're going to be talking about the how of agroforestry and some of the things that listeners should be looking out for and the questions to ask.
Fantastic. In the meantime, please share this episode with your farming network. I really hope that you've got something from it. It's perhaps raised some more questions. It's a good time to actually ask you, James, as well. If someone does have further questions, can they get in touch with you, the rest of the team?
Absolutely. I'm sure we're going to have it in the show notes, but there's a contact email there that you can get in touch, and either myself or one of my team around the country will get back to you and help you with any kind of guidance or advice you might have about anything to do with agroforestry.
Super. Yep, that will be in the show notes. Until next time, though, I'm Ben Eagle. My co-host has been James Ramskir-Gardiner. Only one more episode left in this mini-series, but this has been a Meet the Farmers mini-series episode on agroforestry, produced by Rural Pub Media in association with the Forestry Commission. We'll see you next time.